Well, thank you, everybody. I know that that was a lot of complex science very quickly, and I'm sorry that it has to be complex, but it's the nature of this topic of endocrine disruptors. This is not simple stuff, and one of our goals this morning was to give you some quick feel for how complex and how difficult these issues are. But let me take a few minutes here first to try to summarize what we've covered this morning, and then to point the way forward. So what have we done to summarize? Well, we began by talking about what are endocrine disruptors. And Dr. Swan sketched out for us that these are a diverse group of chemicals, some pesticides, some flame retardants, some plastics chemicals, others, that have the common property that when they get into the body of living organisms, animals and people, that they scramble endocrine signaling. They result in the passage of garbled, disordered messages from one organ to the other. And what are the consequences of that disruption of endocrine signaling? Well, we've focused today on the developmental consequences. What are the effects that result when this scrambling of endocrine signaling occurs in the earliest weeks and months of human life, in the womb especially? And we've focused on three classes of negative effects. First of all, we reviewed the growing body of knowledge that early life exposure to these chemicals can interfere with brain development. And what's the consequences of disordered brain development? Well, loss of intelligence, shortening of attention span, disruption of behavior, all of which plays out as real problems for children as they grow up. Things like dyslexia, learning disabilities, dropping out from high school. These are not just theoretical or molecular events. These are molecular events that have real-world consequences that play out over a lifetime. Toxic effects on the developing brain are especially noxious over the long haul in a child's life and human life because of the fact that the human brain has very, very little capacity to repair itself. If damage is done to the developing brain by toxic chemicals like endocrine disruptors, there's no way that damaged neurons can be replaced. The human brain is a very, very specialized organ, incredibly highly evolved. Each cell has its own responsible function in the brain, and when even a small number of cells are lost because of early exposures to toxic chemicals, there's no way to put those cells back. The only rational way to deal with the brain injury that can be caused by toxic chemicals is to prevent the injury, prevent the exposure from occurring in the first place. Secondly, we learned about the impacts of endocrine disruptors on risk of breast cancer, and we learned that some of these chemicals have been linked to the early accelerated onset of puberty in little girls, and we know from a whole series of studies that have been conducted over many years that earlier onset of puberty is directly linked to increased risk of lifetime breast cancer. Not a good thing. So again, the rational approach to dealing with this problem is to prevent the exposure from occurring in the first place. And then lastly, in this elegant talk that Michelle Lamerle just presented, we get into the subject of what's called chemical obesogens, the notion that certain endocrine disruptors have the capacity, when they get into the human body, to increase risk of obesity, increase risk of diabetes, and then follow all the negative consequences of diabetes that we know so well, which are increased risk of heart disease and stroke, increased risk of blindness, increased risk of all the late consequences of obesity. So I know this was a lot of information presented very quickly, but I hope that we've at least given you a flavor for the type of research that we're doing on endocrine disruptors at Mount Sinai and at brother and sister institutions across the United States. And there's an emerging body of knowledge that the results that are coming out from these studies indicate very clearly that the endocrine disruptors are a potent family of chemicals whose effects we're still uncovering, but that they have the effect to produce profound and lasting injury to the human body, injury whose consequences can persist across the human lifespan. Okay, so that's the problem. What can we do about it? Well, you've heard a lot already. Let me try to summarize that. We've talked first of all about what each of you can do in your own homes. An old colleague of mine, Nancy Chuda, who was the founder of Healthy Child, Healthy World, used to say that the parent is the CEO in their own household, that every parent controls what comes into their house. The father and mother control what products are purchased, what food the family eats, what comes into the home, what gets consumed. So the first level at which each of us can take action is in terms of making intelligent decisions of what we buy, what we feed our kids, what we do and do not do in our own lives. And you've heard a number of the specifics here, and these specifics will be portrayed on our website when these presentations are posted in a few days' time. But to enumerate, one thing you heard was avoid certain classes of plastics, especially the ones that are marked on the bottom of the bottle with the number 3 or the number 7. The second thing you heard very clearly was don't smoke, especially during pregnancy. This is only the 148th reason not to smoke, but it's one more reason not to smoke because it increases children's risk of endocrine disruption. Another thing we heard was minimize exposure to pesticides. You can do this in several ways. One approach is to minimize the use of pesticides in your apartment, in your home. Instead of reflexively spraying the apartment with whatever toxic pesticide the exterminator recommends, say, wait a minute, we don't need to spray this house. Instead of spraying, let's close up the cracks and crevices, which are the points by which the cockroaches enter the room, seal up those cracks and crevices, clean up food residues, clean up any standing water, and if you have to use pesticides, instead of fogging the apartment, use those much safer little baits and gels that you can put in the corner of the room. Just keep them out of the reach of the little children. And that whole approach to minimizing chemicals is called Integrated Pest Management, IPM. You can read about it on the web. Another approach to reducing pesticides is to eat organic. People who eat organic have 90% less pesticides in their body than people who eat what is the misnamed conventionally grown foods, as though to say that foods that are drenched in pesticides are somehow conventional. Now, I understand full well that organic food costs more than conventional food, and that's obviously a barrier for people who have young families and are struggling to make ends meet. But the advice I would give is eat organic where you can afford to. Join a food co-op, do other things that you can do to eat fresher local foods to minimize your intake of toxic pesticides. And then finally, we heard about plastics as a source of endocrine disruptors. What to do there? Well, first of all, I wish this thing wasn't up here. I didn't put it here. We should be minimizing our use of plastics in our daily lives, go back to glass, go back to stainless steel, use products that come from nature rather than from the chemical reactor. That simple action would substantially reduce all of our exposures to endocrine disruptors. It would also take a great load off the landfills that serve New York City. It would greatly reduce the carbon footprint. So those are a few of the highlights of what you can do in your own lives. The second thing you can do is you can be a citizen. I think it's an absolute national scandal that 80,000 chemicals are on the market and only a small number, Judith Hank went over the actual numbers, only a small number of these chemicals have been properly tested in the laboratory to see if they are toxic to people and to see specifically if they are toxic to human development. How did this come about? It's worth taking a minute to review the history of the so-called chemical revolution in this country. Synthetic chemicals first came on the market in the first years of the 20th century, but they didn't really take off until after World War II. And if you look at a graph of chemical production and plastic production, it's pretty flat until about 1955 or so, and then it begins to go up, and it's gone up faster and faster ever since. In 1976, the U.S. Congress passed legislation that was intended to be pioneering legislation that would control the chemical revolution and would require that chemicals be properly tested, that new chemicals be properly tested before they brought on the market, and that chemicals already on the market would be tested to see what was in them and what might be the toxicity. It was called the Toxic Substances Control Act. It was bitterly opposed at the time by the chemical industry. Nonetheless, it passed. It became the law of the land, and it was hailed as the legislation that would protect children and all of us against toxic chemicals. Unfortunately, TSCA, as it's called, Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, taught us that the passage of legislation is not enough, that it's at least as important for the people that are concerned about the environment to monitor what happens to legislation after it's passed. And what happened to TSCA after it was passed in 1977 is a sorry tale indeed, because within 1 or 2 years, the Environmental Protection Agency, obviously long before Judith Hank's time, did what I call retroactive baptism. They looked around the chemical universe. At that time, there were 62,000 chemicals on the market, 80-some thousand today, and they very quickly baptized those 62,000 chemicals, declared that they were safe because, after all, they were on the market, and merrily on our way. And the consequence is that, as Judith Hank said, in the 30-plus years now since the passage of the Toxic Substances Control Act, only 5 chemicals have been removed from the market under that piece of failed legislation. So this is why I say it's important for all of us to be citizens. The reason that chemical reform has not passed the United States Congress in each of the last 3 terms is that the chemical industry has expended millions upon millions of dollars to block such legislation. The trail of this, the money trail has been very carefully laid out in some excellent articles in The Atlantic, in the Huffington Post, other mainstream publications. It's time for citizens to make their voices heard. Senator Lautenberg of New Jersey, Frank Lautenberg, has been the leader in the United States Senate advancing the Safe Chemicals Act. It's time for people that care about their children, people who care about their health, people who care about their environment, to get in touch with Senator Lautenberg and his office and ask what you can do to help. This is a national scandal. We, of course, at Mount Sinai will continue to do our research. We will continue to make breakthrough discoveries, elucidating the impacts of these chemicals on children's health. That's our job, that's our responsibility. But there's also a civic responsibility. We have to control this problem at the source, even as the research continues. The 2 approaches are by no means incompatible. In fact, they're complementary one to the other, and we need them both. So I ask for you all to join that. It's a terribly important cause. What we're going to do now is, starting in just a moment, I'm going to ask this morning's speakers to come on up and be seated at the table. We've been collecting questions in the audience. I'm not going to take questions from the floor, but we'll go through the questions that you've submitted, and of course you're welcome, as the hour proceeds, to submit more questions. We'll do our best in the allocated time to get through all of them. And before I relinquish the podium, I'd like to thank the people who have made this event possible. I've already thanked the staff who put the event together, but I would like all the members. Thank the staff. Katie Southwick and Christopher Scarpati, who are collecting the questions, and also Alvaro McBean, Eileen Solomon, Jeanette Stanislaus, and their staffs who made it possible. But in addition to them, we have a dedicated group of volunteers who support the Children's Environmental Health Center. These are members of our executive board and members of our program committee. A number of them are here. Could I ask you to stand, please, and be recognized? Without this group, it's an army that numbers in the neighborhood of 50 or 60 people. We would simply not be able to do the work that we do. So thanks to all of you.